So this video is going to be the start of a sequence of videos pertaining to the first class that I offer in my tutoring service, and the first class is called Programming Demystified, and really what I'm trying to do here is to, without using the same word again, just talk about a lot of the very introductory concepts when it comes to programming. So really just trying to clarify what is programming, what language are we using, things like that. And there's a lot more to be said on this topic, but really we just want to kind of cover a little bit of groundwork and then jump right into code, which we will do eventually. Alright, so lots to talk about, and I will be breaking up, I think, each of these things into separate videos just to make it kind of digestible and make it so that you can just go back to whichever particular topic is giving you trouble and maybe rewind, rewatch that video, and so forth. So we're going to start off with getting started with the C++ language and this thing called G++, and we'll really talk about what G++ is very soon. Why study C++? And this is one area that many people will argue with you about when you're teaching or in the field. Should you be using C++ to teach people how to program? And I've gone back and forth about this, and I have taught other languages to beginning programmers to great success, but I think C++ is a fantastic language for one main reason, and that I point out later on in this slide is that it is fantastic for developing good habits. It's strict, and if you have a strict foundation, if you are taught in a very strict fashion and you have great habits, then you are well on your way to becoming a competent programmer. So what is C++? And it really is just a powerful programming language that was built as an extension to the C programming language. We will not talk about the C programming language, but it is one of the most common and widespread programming languages. C programs run on such a variety of platforms. Just even the tiniest of devices have the potential to run C programs, and there's a lot more to be said about the C language. It's fantastic, but our focus now is on C++, which was built as an extension to that language. And what does it extend, or how does it extend? What does it offer? What it offers is a more higher level understanding of higher level constructs, classes, and objects, and really it transforms your programs from kind of a recipe into just an interaction of objects. But that's all very much so kind of to be discussed much later on. It's very abstract, very high level. We're not there yet, and so we'll really just kind of talk about it in passing. But the language is fantastic for speed, and that's due to like compiler optimizations, all of this stuff. Again, it's just kind of introductory. I'll be kind of glossing over some of these things, and we'll come back to them later on. Low-level access to memory and hardware, it's fantastic for just getting down and dirty with the hardware, and that has its benefits in certain applications. Okay. It's used all over the place. Okay, so it's powerful, it's used aplenty, and where is it used? Well, just a lot of different areas, and I won't spend too much time on that. But here's the key point for C++. Here is why I am a huge proponent for the language, for using the language to teach students. It's strict. It's unforgiving. If you screw up, you will know about it, and there are plenty of places to screw up with. Okay, why is that good? Well, it's a little daunting, I think, if you're just getting started, but with an instructor, with someone there to really help you and identify those problems and just get you used to these quirks, with that type of instruction and careful attention, then you think about your programs in a very meticulous fashion. You really do look line by line, and you really are thinking every single step of the way, as opposed to just kind of writing code like all willy-nilly, so to speak. So it's very unforgiving, and I think that is what creates very strong programming habits. And I think the same philosophy can apply to, let's say, like martial arts, right? So if you have very strict discipline, then that will further prepare you for the more advanced techniques, as opposed to just being very lazy at the start of your training, right? So C++ is fantastic for that purpose. Others will talk about other languages like Python and so forth when they're trying to teach people, and I think Python is fantastic for teaching students, but the problem is that it makes beginning programmers quite lazy. They expect a lot of the luxuries that come with the Python language, and C++ has very few of those luxuries, if any. Okay, and so it forces you to really think about the problems and to implement your own, and not bank on pre-made solutions. Okay, if that's eventually, I guess the goal is to build up to appreciating those luxuries as opposed to just getting them, at the get-go. So, and I think you can stretch that argument to many other areas or disciplines. So that's my sales pitch on C++, and that's the language that we'll be using to learn how to program. Once you learn C++, you can learn any language, and that point really is just a natural consequence of the previous point with the language being so strict, right, and creating these strong habits. So once you do learn C++, you can learn any language, and I started programming in C++. That's the language that I started, or that I learned as an undergraduate student. And since then, I have learned a ton of other languages just on my own. And so I think that is just one example of that philosophy kind of in action, right? All right, so let's talk about G++. And G++ is not a language, though it looks very similar to C++. But G++ is what's known as a compiler. And I will talk about that term, compiler, and it was developed for the GNU operating system. That detail aside, what is a compiler? Compiler is a program that understands a language, and this is in the most general sense, right? G++ is a compiler that understands the C++ language in addition to a bunch of other ones, but we'll focus on C++, and it's used to create computer programs. So really, think of the compiler as a program that is used to create other programs. And that sounds pretty awesome right at the beginning. So I think in terms of a picture, a compiler, well, first off, and this picture will become more and more clear as we continue to progress through our introduction, but you have some file here, which is your C++ file, and it contains lines of instructions written in the C++ language, right, that we will learn. So you have this regular text file that has all of the C++ code in it, and what you do is you take that file and you hand it off to this kind of middle entity here, which is our G++ compiler. What this compiler does is it takes your code here and it checks to make sure that you're using the language appropriately, right? So it'll say, hey, did you miss any sort of punctuation marks? Did you misspell anything? Are you kind of creating ambiguities? All of that stuff that we'll get to later on. So the G++ compiler takes that program, and then what it does is it gives you an output which is some executable program, right? Which boils down to a lot of just nitty-gritty details, binary numbers, and so forth that we'll kind of touch on later on, right? So just zeros and ones and so forth. And the executable file is nice because it is then processable by the CPU, or can be processed by the CPU, which is ultimately what we're doing at the end of the day, right? You double-click on a program or on an icon that somehow looks for this executable file, and that's kind of what gets executed for us. That allows us to see our program and use it. So those, I mean, there are a lot of details when talking about executable files and the whole execution of a program, but really we're just kind of at this tip of the iceberg, so to speak. So getting back to our discussion on the compiler, you give it a C++ file, it does some nice conversions and magic for us, and then it gives us an executable program that we can run and use. So that's what a compiler really is, and the G++, again, is just a compiler that understands this C++ language, in addition to a couple of other ones. Alright. And as an added detail, it translates all the code once, and then every time you need to run your program, it can just use that translated version. And that really does contrast to an alternate form of creating programs known as interpretation, or using an interpreter. And I won't talk about that, just to keep things pretty simple at this very introductory level. How do we get G++? There are a couple of ways of getting this G++ compiler. And again, understand that we need this C++ language, and we have some text file that's going to contain lines of code, and then we need this G++ compiler. Otherwise, we really have no way of performing that translation from that language into an executable file. So G++ is essential, or a compiler is necessary, right? There are three ways of getting this compiler, this particular compiler. The first way is for all of you Windows users, and I'm particularly using Windows right now, so I will showcase many of my code samples and the compiling of my programs using this Cygwin environment. All right, Cygwin, C-Y-G-W-I-N, and it's simulated Unix environment for Windows. So I don't have time to get into the whole Unix thing. Maybe there could be a separate video on that. But what it does is allows us to gain access to some really awesome command line options, and I'll show you all of that stuff. And then we also have access to the G++ compiler, and I have a separate video on installing, or so downloading and installing Cygwin, and also installing G++ for the Cygwin environment. And then I also have a video on using G++ to compile our first computer program in the C++ language. So you can check those out on YouTube as well. So Cygwin. And again, there's videos on how to get all of that cool stuff installed. For you Mac users, well, you can use Xcode, and Xcode really is just a huge download, right? So it's a 10 gigabyte download if you don't already have it installed, and that's huge. That takes forever, and unfortunately we won't be using Xcode. And the plethora of tools available to us via that development environment, we will only use Xcode to get access to G++, and so we won't be using a lot of the extra jazz that comes with it. And similarly to Cygwin, right? When you see a lot of these YouTube videos on how to learn like introductory programming, everyone is telling you go download Microsoft Visual Studio or Microsoft C++ Express Edition and all of these really fancy tools. And you open up those tools and there are just a ton of options, right? The problem is that first off, you have to go about learning all of these options, and they're just so high level and so unnecessary to talk about at the very introductory stage. So what I like to do is just strip everything away and talk about just using basic tools, the essential tools to getting our C++ development underway. So that means no fanciness when it comes to integrated development environments. No, we won't use these programs that will try to guess what we're trying to type into it, right? That will try to complete our code for us. Now that might sound very attractive to beginners, but trust me, it creates a very bad habit, or very bad habits. So we will be using Cygwin and G++ in their very pure forms, and some sort of word processing application that I'll talk about in the next slide. Alright, so that's Windows and that's Mac. And the last option is really just if you're using the Linux operating system or any sort of flavor of the Linux operating system, then you should have G++ installed by default. And if not, it is like a one-line operation in the terminal that allows you to get G++ and install it and all of that cool stuff. So those are three ways to get access to this compiler. So you've done that. Let's talk about getting started, just the rudimentary steps to creating our first C++ program. Now, I will not talk about our first program in detail just yet. I'll save that for another video, but this is just the kind of the preliminary work to compiling what we will talk about in the future. C++ programs are stored in text files, but these text files need a certain extension. That extension is the .cpp. Okay? And when I talk about extensions, what I'm really talking about is things that you're probably familiar with. Let's say for images, you have extensions like .jpg or .png or a bunch of other ones, right? So that's extensions for images. When you talk about, let's say, documents that you create, now you probably are referring to .txt or maybe .rtf for the more basic ones, or you're talking about the more commonplace one, which is .doc, okay, which is like a Microsoft Word type of extension. If you're talking about Excel spreadsheets, then you're talking about XLS as your extension. So that's what I mean by file extension, and usually you don't just see this, you'll see some name associated with that particular file, right? So this will be like my picture, mypic.jpg, and you'll double click on that file and you'll see a picture, right? So this is just the file name, and then this is the file extension. So getting back to our discussion on C++, our C++ programs will have the .cpp extension, and so what we'll do is create some program or some file, and we can call it whatever we'd like, right? As we could call these images anything. We'll call it, let's say, my program .cpp, or you could just swap this out for whatever you want to call it, okay? So that really is just hopefully a clarification on the CPP extension. We need this CPP extension to indicate that these files are C++ files, or C++ programs that should be compiled. Okay. How do we create these programs? We understand that we need a certain extension. How do we create these things? Well, we're going to be using a text processing or word processing application for this. Which one? Well, for Windows users, what I recommend is going bare bones Notepad, or you can download an open source, a free version of Notepad called Notepad++, which really offers some useful features. For example, it can change the colors of some words in your program, which is nice. It makes your programs kind of, it breaks the monotony of like the black and white programs. So it makes it a little bit easier to read and to navigate through. And yeah, and it can do that for a bunch of other languages, not just C++. So HTML and PHP and all of that cool stuff. So Notepad++ is awesome. I use it, and I will be using it for my code sample demonstrations. Either one is fine. For Mac users, you should be using a program called TextEdit. TextEdit is one of the most basic text editing programs in the Mac environment. However, as nice as it is or could be, there's a particular option that you have to set by default, and it's you go to this format menu and you hit make plain text. Now, why would you do that? And why would you use Notepad to begin with? Well, you know, why can't I use Microsoft Word? I love Microsoft Word. Well, the problem is that Microsoft Word and let's say other programs, more complicated text or word processing programs, they add formatting information to your files. They add lines, hidden lines that you don't see that say, oh, this word here should be centered, and oh, this word here should be left aligned and right aligned, and there was a character turn here, or there's this underlined and so forth, and this is this particular font, that particular font. All of that information is unnecessary for our C++ programs, because all of that information, all of those hidden lines of metadata or formatting data, they are not part of our C++ programming language. And so when you use programs like Microsoft Word and you feed that file into the compiler says, what the hell are you talking about? I have no idea what it means to be centered or to be underlined or bolded. Okay, so we need to use very simple programs, and that's why I recommend Notepad, and that's why I recommend TextEdit, given that you understand this little option here to make it plain text, to say, TextEdit, I know you're good, I like you a lot, but there's just one thing about you that I don't like, and we have to set this option every time we want to compile our C++ or create a C++ program. All right. So compiling programs using our new compiler. This is the command that you'll put into the window that pops up. So if you're using Cygwin, you'll see the Cygwin bash shell, and again, if you go through my videos on that, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You'll use that Cygwin bash shell, or if you're on Mac, you'll use the terminal. All right, and so you can use the terminal, and within those two, or one of those two, depending on your environment, what you'll do is put in this command here. So you'll type in G++, and then you'll put in the name of your file, and it doesn't have to be homework1, right? It could be whatever you named your file to be, or your program, and you need that .cpp extension. You have to include this .cpp extension, and I talk about that extensively in the video. All right. So with that said, what we're doing here is, again, that whole process of compiling, right? So taking our C++ program here, homework1, feeding it into this compiler called G++. What does G++ do, as I said? It creates some executable output, and the name of that output or the name of that executable file differs based on what operating system you're using. For Windows users, you will see a.exe produced by G++. For Mac users or Linux users, you will see a.out. All right. So what does that mean? But basically, both of those things are executable files, and they have the default name of A. Okay. So why this A thing? Well, that's just the default name, right? You didn't actually specify in this process of compiling what you wanted the executable to be called, and so it was just called A, and it had the extension that says to that operating system, hey, this is an executable file that can be processed or run or whatever you want to say. So how do we change the name? Well, there's a particular option that you can include in this line here, but we won't talk about that because it's extra typing and it's unnecessary, really. And when you get to the point where you need to change the executable name, then we'll worry about it. But for now, just understand what's given to us by default, and we like that. We can use that. We're happy with that. To run the program, you will type in /, right? Whether it be in the terminal or in the Cygwin bash shell, depending on your environment. And then you'll type in that executable name, the name of the executable, and then the extension, remember. And this particular line here is for Windows users, and this one here is for Linux or Mac users. All right. So it is then time to embark on our very first program, the Hello World program. And that's the end of this particular portion of the discussion. Again, subscribe for more videos on this, and check out my website here if you're interested in the tutoring service. And if you have questions, please feel free to email me. See you in the next video.